The Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, may have some very serious questions to answer after his former private secretary, Angus Sinclair, told the BBC's Newsnight programme just last night that he experienced bullying at the hands of the Speaker and that he subsequently left his job as a consequence.
There was one afternoon I was working at my desk and he came in and he was absolutely furious about something. He asked for some information from another part of the house and it had been very slow in coming, but he held me responsible and there was a tirade of how I'd let him down. It was quite the worst thing, a lot of bad language, and suddenly his mobile phone, which he'd been holding, was flung on the desk in front of me, and it broke into a lot of bits. Perhaps one of the worst aspects of it is from time to time you would hear yourself mimicked. And your thought then is that really how he sees me?
Angus Sinclair speaking last night. You'll remember last October that John Bercow, the Speaker, spoke out from the chair in the House of Commons very strongly about some of the behaviour he is now being accused of himself.
There must be zero tolerance of sexual harassment or bullying here at Westminster or elsewhere.
Well, there are now calls in some quarters for Mr Speaker to stand down, though he has his supporters too, some of whom believe these are old allegations being dredged up again to distract attention away from the Windrush scandal, which is pretty inconvenient, to say the least, for the government at the moment. I'm joined by Mark Wallace, Executive Editor of Conservative Home, and Labour's Peter Hain, Lord Hain, who detects something else going on behind these claims of bullying. Welcome to both of you. Good afternoon. Peter Hain, let's begin with you. What else do you think is going on? Welcome.
This sounds like more of an office row, frankly, than a personality clash between Angus Sinclair and Speaker Bercow. When you actually listen to what he said, mimicry, yes, John Bercow is a very good mimic. I've heard him mimicking some of the highest people in Parliament and in the land, and he's very good at it. But I think at the heart of it is the fact that there's a great deal of resentment amongst some traditionalist MPs, mostly on the Conservative benches, though not entirely, and amongst parliamentary officials, at the fact that he's been a very radical reforming speaker, probably the most radical and reforming in living memory, maybe even in the history of Parliament. And I think that has attracted criticism from people who don't agree with him. He's ruffled feathers. I know for a fact, I was leader of the House of Commons, there's a lot of entrenched traditionalism in Parliament. People don't like change. And what I notice also is that the Speaker himself has flatly and strongly denied these allegations of bullying. And I know personally members of his staff who served for years and years and years. And you can go into the Speaker's office and chat to them, as I've done over the years, especially as an MP, but even as a member of the House of Lords. And they are loyal to him and they like working for him. And I think this is just a particular example which has nothing to do with bullying.
Mark Wallace, is that what's going on? It's a backlash from the old guard against a very radically progressive Speaker.
No, in a word. And I think, to be honest with you, I'm quite shocked by what Peter's just had to say about this. The fact is that, do some people disagree with John Bercow's approach to running Parliament or his politics? Yes, they do. Do some of his staff have experience of working with him for a very long time? Yes, they do. Does any of that mean that the behaviour we're now hearing about is acceptable? No. Does it mean inherently that the people who are making these reports, evidently quite a lot of discomfort to themselves? Does it mean that they must be lying? No, and I think this is pretty shoddy. I just wonder how it would sound if...
he's lying. I've said that...
I mean, you just said it isn't true, I think.
Well, no, he didn't say that. He said it sounds more like an office row rather than bullying.
So when we hear about another former member of staff who says that she allegedly suffered the symptoms of PTSD after her time working there, that she was bullied, when this particular individual talks about his employer shouting and swearing, throwing a phone allegedly, as well as mimicking. I just don't think it's okay to come say, well, that's just kind of how things go in an office. For example, talking about John Bercow being a good mimic of the great and good and powerful in the land is totally different to somebody's employer, and the chief executive of our parliament, allegedly having this approach to his staff and subordinates. And I think I just don't think in any other industry, I don't think that this would be acceptable. That's why
we don't know the context.
In what context is it okay for an employer to throw a phone at somebody's desk so hard that it breaks?
Well, look, I don't. If that happens,
as is alleged,
that's not something that I would agree with.
Would that be bullying? If that happened?
Why by comparison? Has he got other staff, including his current private secretaries, worked for him for years, both as his Speaker's secretary and assistant Speaker's secretary, for years and years and years. There are obviously two individuals. Unfortunately, there's been a disagreement, whatever the detail of that, who knows, and they've fallen out. This happens in organizations. But to equate that with bullying, if that were the case, then nobody would go and work for him.
I'm sorry, but I just find this gobsmacking. Let's consider, for example, the Me Too scandal. We just heard the quote of John Bercow talking quite rightly about how Parliament must not tolerate that. In similar cases in other industries, when somebody's accused of something, is it fair and right to stand up to then say, well, he's been around other people, so he must be okay with everybody? That simply isn't how life works. Unfortunately, there may be a personality clash, there may be a disagreement. It's how somebody responds to that as somebody in a position of power that matters. And I'm afraid to say that part of my concern about this, I wrote back in November in my column for the iPaper about the issue, a separate issue but related, of some MPs who bully their own staff in their own offices, and that needs addressing. It needs to address it, we need to have leadership in the House itself. And I'm afraid when he's enmeshed in something like this, I just don't see how John Bercow can do what's needed for the whole House and for alleged victims and deal with this issue properly.
We're talking to Mark Wallace from Conservative Home and Lord Hain, Peter Hain. Let's take some of your calls. Nick, first of all, who's in Yorkshire. Hello, Nick.
Yes, good morning to you. Every time I hear this man's name, it just makes my blood curdle. We were on about this on LBC the other week. Basically, the man suffers from the Napoleon complex. He seems to think that somehow it's his own personal thiefdom, Westminster. When he showed Obama around, it was cringing, as if he was showing him round his own alma mater or his own apartments or whatever. And then his wife, the Amazonian woman that goes on television and drapes herself in men's magazines while he cuckolds on behalf of some traveller that appears in the same
Nick, let's try to keep it reasonably civil. Let's try to keep it reasonably civil.
I believe that it's been reasonably civil. The man obviously is an embarrassment to the position. You never got this with Betty Boothroyd. It's time he went.
There are people who disagree, and clearly you're one of them, who disagree with John Bercow as a speaker. Well, you're entitled to your view.
Absolutely.
I happen to think he's an excellent speaker, but that has nothing to do with an allegation about bullying. I mean, what is interesting about John Bercow's position is when he was voted in as Speaker, and I admit I voted for him enthusiastically, women in Parliament overwhelmingly voted for him, especially on the Labour benches, though not exclusively. Now, if he was a bully, on the contrary, he's actually been a feminist speaker as well, in terms of encouraging equal opportunities in Parliament. And there are a whole series of reforms he's put in place to support staff, to brush away all the cobwebs of traditionalism that have resisted change, whether on the security front, running the place properly. It's a huge empire, is Parliament. All of that, has aroused resentment, and I actually think that's at the bottom of this.
Let's get a final word from Nick in Yorkshire.
Yeah, I just think he acts above his pay grade, and I find the man is more into the celebrity of his role. Regardless of whether you think that's a fair remark or not, I will be glad to see the back of him and somebody else in his position. Thank you very much.
Nick, thank you for your call.
Thank you.
Very strong comments from Nick there. What about John in North Belfast? How do you see it, John?
Hello, Mr. Burke. This isn't the first time allegations have arose over John Bercow and his behaviour towards his staff. Now, Parliament, MPs as a whole, have got a bad name. And here is someone who basically is a referee between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, who's married in alleged controversy himself. Is it any wonder that the Joe public do not trust Parliament and its MPs?
John, thanks very much. Peter Hain, what about this non-disclosure agreement and the suggestion from Angus Sinclair that he was paid pretty much a year's salary, about £86,000, to go early from his job?
As far as I know, and I don't know anything about the details, as far as I know, Speaker Bercow had nothing to do with that. That was a human relations employment issue on the House of Commons staff.
It's not
side.
typical that someone would have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, is it? It's not typical.
No, I don't suppose it is. But often,
and
when
he certainly takes the view that that was about covering up the bullying, doesn't he? You're not allowed to talk about that. He's in breach of it now, he says.
Well, he said that he's made an allegation. I haven't heard any evidence of bullying. I might have heard evidence of behaviour that I wouldn't, conduct myself. But I've heard no evidence of bullying, and I don't know the circumstances of the non-disclosure agreement. But at the bottom of this, look, as I say, this is an office row rather than an example of bullying. And what I do notice also is that there's been no evidence of bullying, whereas in the case of a number of MPs, there clearly has been bullying, and that has been exposed, as well as sexual harassment, and that has been exposed, and people should be brought to justice for that, whether they're MPs or whoever they are, especially if they're MPs, because they have very high standards to live up to, or ought to.
It's almost as if, Peter Hain, it's almost as if you're saying that if anyone's been bullied here, it's the Speaker.
No, I'm not saying that. John Bercow is quite capable of standing up for himself, and he does that very robustly. But
you got the old guard trying to take him out.
Well, I do think there's an element of that. They've been trying to get rid of him for years. He's a speaker who grants backbench urgent questions and calls ministers to the House to issue statements, to make statements, far more, and grants backbench debates and opposition debates far more than any of his predecessors. Now, I think that's good, because that would be the case for a Labour government as well, by the way. I think that's good, because Parliament should be about holding the executive to account, and lots of speakers in the past have been far too establishment-minded. He is very much in favour of popular sovereignty by the people, and through them their backbench MPs, and I think that's to be applauded.
Mark Wallace, when you look at the behaviour or the choice of response, let's put it that way, of John Bercow from the chair while he's Speaker, he's often criticised for his behaviour there too, that he shouts in a certain aggressive sort of way, that he's capable of headmasterly behaviour, humiliating behaviour, some say, in the way that he speaks to people from the chair. Do you see that in the chair?
Well, listen, I personally am a fan of the things that Peter's just been talking about broadly in terms of John Bercow's attitude to Parliament. I'm not a fan of his style in the chair, but by and large, I think back to the MP's expenses scandal, and we saw what happened when the authorities of the House were slow, for one reason or another, to properly deal with, and unfortunately was somewhat compromised in their authority. My concern is, having personally spoken to people who've been victims of bullying, not by John Bercow, but by other MPs, people who've been deeply traumatised and deeply negatively affected by that, my concern is that a speaker who is compromised on this issue, who for whatever reason cannot simply step aside while this is properly investigated, could compromise that for everybody, and that would be very harmful to Parliament.
How long does he have in the job, Mark?
If that were the case, I would agree with Mark, but I don't think, simply because this allegation, which I don't think amounts to a great deal, to be perfectly frank, I don't think that the Speaker should be forced to stand aside simply because of that. I really do not think so.
You don't think there should be an investigation, Peter Hain? No investigation?
Pardon?
Should there be an investigation?
Into what?
Into what we just heard from Angus Sinclair?
One allegation, not of bullying, but of
two allegations.
He fell out. Well, he fell out with his employer when other staff have served him loyally for years and years and years and continue to do so. I don't understand why that should provoke this degree of attention.
Mark, you've got about 20 seconds, sir.
Bullying is not a show of hands. Sometimes it happens to one person and not to other people in the same office.
Mark Wallace, Executive Editor of Conservative Home. Lord Hain, Peter Hain, thank you very much. That's it on that. We're still taking your calls, texts and tweets, of course, but we've got to move on because we'll be talking about the